Hello and welcome to the Final Girls podcast. This is Anna, co-founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. If you're new to the show, every season we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism, looking at a particular trope in depth. And in this third season, we are discussing the most elegant and the horniest of movie monsters. In each episode, I'm joined by a special guest to dive deep into a vampire movie or two or three. We discuss the films in detail, contextualize them, and think about what works and what doesn't. And in today's episode, we go from the Blade Trilogy to the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, taking in the luxurious moodiness of Michio Yamamoto's Bloodthirsty Trilogy. Inspired by the gothic stylings of Hammer horror films from the 60s, Toho Studios produced this truly bizarre but very beautiful series of films. The trilogy is comprised of The Vampire Doll, Lake of Dracula, and Evil of Dracula. All three films are independent of each other, but feature mysterious, eerie vampires, dark family secrets, atmospheric big houses, and one of them, a face-removing scene that will live in my nightmares rent-free. We discuss all three of the films, and unusually for this podcast, we don't give away any plot details. So if you haven't seen any of the films in the Bloodthirsty Trilogy, we won't be spoiling anything, but you can get a real sense of what you're in for. I'm joined in this episode by the writer, podcaster, and friend of the Final Girls, Becky Dark, to discuss the blood, boobs, and mustard-colored sartorial choices of the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. This entire vampire season is made possible with the support of Arrow Video, who bring out the very best in cult, horror, and genre films. Throughout the season, we are recommending a film that we love from their vast collection, which now spans more than 500 titles. The Bloodthirsty Trilogy is actually an Arrow Video release, so that's our recommendation for the week. And it's a beautiful Blu-ray packing in the three films and a ton of extras that contextualize these weirdo films. Alongside our vampire chats, we're also covering select new releases of horror films that we're really excited about, and we will put the spoiler-free versions on the main feed right over here as usual, and the full in-depth spoiler-free conversations will be over on our Patreon. If you want to, head over to patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all of that said, please enjoy our spoiler-free discussion of the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. Becky, welcome back.
Thank you.
Always a wonderful presence on the Final Girls podcast. How have you been doing?
Not too bad. Lockdown 3 has been, it's been real. But staying busy, and I feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel now. I had my first vaccine jab yesterday. I know. Yes.
Woo!
Yeah. Thank you, the NHS. I feel like we're getting there slowly but surely. Yeah. And I've been, able to spend lots of time watching amazing 1970s Japanese vampire films. So, plus.
Well, thank you very much for that beautiful segue into the films that we're going to be talking about today. The three films that comprise the Bloodthirsty Trilogy. So because these are probably slightly lesser known films, the most recent vampire films that we've been discussing on the podcast, as I mentioned in the introduction, we're going to keep it light touch on the spoiler territory. So for anyone who's not seen these films, they are available. They're out there, edited by Arrow. So you can watch them, and we're going to try to kind of skirt around any plot details that might be spoilery, mainly because I'm quite keen for people to discover these films.
Oh, big time. When you sort of suggested doing these, and they were new to me, which I love Japanese horror. I love 1970s vampire films, so this really just kind of meshed so many of my key interests. And I was like, oh, amazing, they do them on Arrow Blu-ray. And you were like, oh, I can send you links, don't worry. I was like, no, that's fine. I'm surprised these aren't already in my collection. Please don't take away my excuse to purchase these.
I would never. So tell me, Becky, had you heard of the Bloodthirsty Trilogy before?
No, like totally new to me. And like I say, in some ways that kind of like, I'm surprised, like I'm a little bit disappointed in myself because it really does this trilogy really ticks like so many of my boxes. So yeah, a very welcome discovery through you, and I had so much fun watching them.
Knowing that this was your first time coming to them, did you have any particular expectations based on your love for 70s vampire films and your love for Japanese horror?
I expected a lot of big hair, which I got, so that was great. The kind of, I wasn't expecting them to be so, like, they get quite creepy, and like they really you can see some real seeds of the kind of 90s 2000s like J-horror scares and like real imagery in these films, like really like creepy smiles, like women with long dark hair sort of looking up through their hair, sort of like with these, you know, very dramatic looks. Plus, I mean, it's the 70s, so there was a lot of mustard, a lot of brown, and a lot of mini skirts. I mean, you know, it's just, what a joy.
So we're kind of going to go slightly by chronological order in these, but there's a lot of kind of interweaving themes or things that are quite similar between the films. So let's start with The Vampire Doll, which is the first one in the trilogy and was released in 1970. What did you make of this film in particular? And do you see it as a vampire film?
I do see it as a vampire film. It's funny really, because there's parts about it that I feel like could be more of almost like a haunted house movie, but there is enough kind of sort of bloodletting and more of the kind of like gothic floaty robes and like detective stuff. Like I feel like some of the more sort of like Van Helsing side of things comes through and really sort of brings that classic like vampire vibe. In some ways I think The Vampire Doll is maybe the least vampire-y of the three, but I do think there's enough kind of like obvious, you know, return from the dead, lots of pale makeup, lots of hanging around by gravestones. That, you know, it's absolutely a vampire film.
And what did you make of the atmosphere of it?
I loved it. Like, I love the way that these films look. They've almost got that kind of the Arrow transfers, for one thing, are really beautiful. So if people can get hold of the Blu-rays, I'd highly recommend it. It's got that sort of that sort of soft focus, beautiful sort of hazy visuals, lots of kind of mist. People are familiar with the film Hausu. It's got some of that sort of like those really sort of bright and like pastel-y colours and sort of big dark stormy skies and like sort of mysteriously lit houses. Atmosphere wise, you know, I thought it really kind of, it ticked the boxes in terms of it being sort of gothic enough. Like they mention in the film at one point that they live in like a Western style house. So even though it is Japan, you know, with it being in the 70s, there is obviously in the like aesthetics and the production design and also the plot, like there's a lot of kind of Western influence on it. You get a couple of the older characters who dress in more sort of traditional Japanese like kimono or kind of more like rural dress, but the younger characters are all in kind of, you know, mini dresses and like roll necks and stuff, you know, roll necks and blazers, very 70s. So, you know, you get the kind of modernity, you get the gothic side of things with the sort of big Western style house and the fact that this woman, this sort of older lady, has got like a sort of deaf and mute butler kind of servant who plays, you know, that very sort of classic sort of vampire film role of just sort of being threatening in the shadows. It's got that that sort of, I mean, these are kind of contemporary with like the Hammer films, a lot of the sort of Hammer Dracula films, and there is an element of that kind of influencing the look, I think, and the.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like I think it wears its Hammer influence on its sleeve. Like it feels very much, not to reduce it to like a copy or anything like that, but you can tell that the kind of the Hammer horror formula or their kind of contained kind of set pieces and the gothic-y influences that you mentioned before, and kind of even the way that a lot of the horror elements are told through the dialogue and the story, as opposed to necessarily emphasizing the gory bits, except for very choice scenes. And kind of, I don't know if you had that feeling, but while I was watching it, I was very intrigued because I was like, oh, this is kind of moody. This is kind of like the plot for Psycho, basically, because it's a lot about, you know, the sister coming to look for her brother with her boyfriend. And it's like basically essentially what happens in the second part of Psycho as well.
Time.
And kind of this, you know, these family secrets and a lot of stuff that isn't talked about, and this kind of atmosphere of distrust that they build up just through. And I'm not sure, you know, maybe this is a little bit as well of kind of both a distance from the culture, which I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with Japanese culture. So there's a certain kind of difference, and also the difference of time. Like this is very much, it's contemporary to the 70s. It's filmed and made in the 70s, so there is also like a removal because of that. And I was like, okay, this is quite formal, very gothic-y. It's a type of brand of gothic that I'm not familiar with, that I haven't seen that often, where there's like the British gothic and the American gothic is something that we've seen a lot and read a lot in books. So there's always that weird eeriness, almost like a little mist, like you mentioned before, kind of covering. Not that this is at all in the transfer, but I almost felt the vibe of like, oh, there's a mist going on in my living room and in the film as it's happening.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, it completely makes sense. I know exactly what you mean. I was really into the atmosphere of them.
And what did you make of, you know, because, and also then, you know, this is again not really spoilery, but we do get to see the vampire, the titular vampire doll, Yuko, and I wasn't scared, but I was unsettled by her. What did you make of her and the way that she's portrayed in the film?
I loved that it was a like female vampire kind of like at the center of this story, because the next two, Lake of Dracula and Evil of Dracula, goes much more back to the kind of traditional sort of Dracula story, where it's like one main male vampire at the center, and then there are some kind of peripheral like female vampires, like sort of Brides of Dracula. Whereas with the vampire doll, it really does center on this central figure of Yuko. Is it Yuko? Yes. Who is this sort of, you know, the vampire doll. She is extremely beautiful. Like I love I aspire to this kind of like makeup coverage. The kind of blue white, it's like the perfect like Halloween. She's nailed it. She's like dewy and yet like kind of blue and obviously undead, but just so beautiful. And I think she like they're possibly using like contacts for her as well, and obviously she's got that very sort of long, absolutely jet black hair. Again, it's always kind of falling in front of her face, and she's sort of looking up through it. She's got that very uncanny smile that she does when you know she's about to do something super evil. You know, I mean, I found her like really kind of like really captivating as a baddie.
There's also something about the way she moves, which is almost like both ghost-like and kind of very physical. Because I don't know about you, but because I knew, I hadn't seen these films before either. I just knew of them by name. And when Yuko appears on screen, I genuinely was thinking, is she a ghost or is she a vampire?
Mm-hmm.
I was like, because there's something about the way the actress moves in the shot, which is so ethereal and so kind of feels out of this world, even out of the world of the story. But again, because it is kind of more, because it's the 70s, because the special effects are not super out there. It's not like she's transparent or anything. There's a kind of corporal figure to her, and the way she grabs the knife and grabs and attacks, some characters is in a film that's kind of so slow and lingering and atmospheric, almost comes as a shock.
Yeah, definitely. And there is a point quite towards the end where she almost does move in that sort of like Ringu kind of way. She's almost like jerky, and she moves very fast, and it is a kind of, it's uncanny, but you're right, it is ethereal, and it's with the gothic side of things as well. She is dressed in this sort of flowy 1970s gown, white, plain white with these sort of huge bell sleeves, and there's a bit where she's sort of seen like running across a garden, which I thought was very sort of Bram Stoker, like Lucy in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Like it's absolutely drawing from so many of those influences.
What did you think about this image of the vampire in kind of in the, not daylight exactly, but sort of twilight, and surrounded by this greenery that I don't know. I don't know. What did you make of it? Because I found it very evocative.
Yeah, same. And this is something that does sort of run through the whole trilogy, actually. They're always kind of being like victims being drawn out of the houses or the kind of schools or the hospitals to meet the vampires kind of in the woods. It's kind of spoken about a lot in terms of folklore. It seems that there's almost an already kind of an existing understanding about vampires, and that it's just kind of part of folklore and sort of local history. They do seem a bit more kind of rooted to like sort of nature, and there's almost especially with the first one, actually, with this idea of the sister and the boyfriend sort of coming from the city out into the country, and sort of being confronted by, as you were saying, all these sort of secrets, and there is almost a folk horror kind of element to it, that they've come from the city and now they're suddenly surrounded by countryside and vampires, and are a bit kind of out of their depth. And I agree that there's something very evocative about having the vampires kind of grounded in this nature setting.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's something that I think really moves in a totally different direction in the second film, in Lake of Dracula, which was released the following year in 1971. And I find it really interesting that you mentioned something a little bit earlier, that Vampire Doll really centers on this thread of a female vampire, or a female possessed by the spirit of a vampire in some way. And Lake of Dracula it wasn't called Lake of Dracula in Japanese, in the original Japanese release, but it kind of is just a story of Dracula, isn't it? It
kind of is, yeah.
A
sort of mysterious box turns up, and then a kind of local he's like the kind of owner of the sort of like boat rental and kind of fishing shop, isn't he? And he's almost the kind of like Renfield character who sort of takes in this coffin and is becomes like one of the victims. And then Dracula starts sort of popping up at the tops of staircases and sort of looming down on people and that. I mean, yeah, definitely Lake of Dracula is much more, I think, traditionally what we are familiar with in terms of that narrative.
And what did you make of this second installment in the Bloodthirsty Trilogy then?
I liked it. I think so I think the three films for me decrease in their effectiveness. I was personally the biggest fan of Vampire Doll. I thought Lake of Dracula was really good, and there's then this kind of gap of then like 3 years before Evil of Dracula, and there's such a like a stark contrast between like 1970 and 1974. The sexual politics is very, and like the gender politics is very different. There's a lot more boobs, for example. I'm
significantly more boobage in the
significantly more just
Evil
like,
of Dracula.
Like so many nipple close-ups, and I'm not averse to it, Anna. You know, I'm not mad. I'm not. But
not mad about the nipples, not at all.
No, never. But you know, it does kind of act as a nice, like, tangible example of like the difference between Vampire Doll and Evil of Dracula. Vampire Doll is much more kind of sort of subdued, subtle, quiet, slow, whereas by the time you get to 74 and Evil of Dracula, there's just a lot of like boobs and fight scenes, which again, you know, it's fine. But you get Lake of Dracula in the middle, and I think it sort of treads that that kind of line between the other two. It's still got that more kind of quiet, slow, sort of rural, misty kind of atmosphere. It's beautiful to look at. There's an opening scene which has got these kids kind of playing down by the shore of the lake. This super wide shot, and it's got this beautiful kind of pastel sunset and these silhouettes of these little kids, and like, I mean, what an opening shot. Like, it's so beautiful. And then that's like quite quickly contrasted by what we would recognize, I think, as more kind of like traditionally gothic vampire film imagery of, you know, the kind of misty old house and a scary old man and a sort of creepy lady playing a piano and all of that kind of thing.
And I wanted to ask you, what did you make of, we've mentioned that this is pretty much a sort of kind of retelling of the Dracula story, but what did you make of Dracula himself, who's played here by Shin Kishida? And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name in any way.
The Draculas, the Draculas in these, I think personally, are a little weak. Certainly in this one, he plays him a little more like, I thought, a little more like Frankenstein than he does Dracula. Like, he's very kind of, he doesn't have any swagger, for one thing. And he just kind of grunts a lot, and he's very stiff. And I don't know, I didn't get a lot of smolder from him, Anna. I mean,
not enough smolder to be Dracula.
No, he's no Frank Langella, is he? I mean, well, who is? But
listen, why'd you have to bring up Frank Langella?
I'm sorry. I should have trigger warninged you.
It's trying to keep this above board. Keep dragging me into the gutter. I have my Frank Langella bug looking at me.
Oh, there he is.
No, I have to turn him around now because it's triggering. But I find it really interesting that you meant there's something, he does grunt a lot. He doesn't move very smoothly. I don't know if you noticed, it's just like there's not that much movement from Dracula, and also not from the camera. Like, it's a lot of very intense zooms on his face instead of letting him glide through the scene.
Yes, absolutely. And when he does move, it is it's more kind of stiff and sort of stompy, more kind of Frankenstein-esque than sort of gliding, you know, like Dracula we may more expect to do. It's funny you mention about the quite sort of static camera work and just like lots of kind of dramatic zooms. I feel like a lot of the work is done by dramatic close-ups and like amazing lighting. Like there's some like really kind of classic gothic like horror film lighting, like lots of kind of it's black in the background, but you know there's like a spot just like completely on their eyes, or there's one scene, it's like a kind of deathbed scene where again it's just absolutely sort of pitch black in the background with just the bed like brightly lit, and I thought that the kind of lighting and a lot of the close-up work was doing a lot of the heavy lifting.
Interesting. And it also has a lot more special effects. Like it goes for a bit more gore, which again might seem a little bit dated now, but there's a smidge of gore, which definitely isn't present in Vampire Doll, which is a lot more, like you mentioned, kind of ethereal, and there's a threat, and the threat is kind of in the ideas that it conjures and particular images, as opposed to any blood or excess kind of body horror. But what did you make of those? And without saying what the scene is, I think we both know exactly what scene I'm thinking of, where there is someone who is smushed.
Oh, yeah.
Someone is smushed. Yep. Smushed in quite a long scene. The smushing went on for a while.
I feel like there's elements of smushing in all three of these films. There's some really interesting kind of red threads that run through this trilogy. One is the smushing. Like fair enough, it does happen to varying degrees, and this is probably the most dramatic example of it. But also, I don't know if you noticed, but in all three films, a rat gets thrown from off camera to like land at the feet of a screaming woman, and it happened in the first two.
No!
And I was like, it's just so funny because it's meant to be like, you know, somebody goes down to a basement, and to add extra peril, obviously there are kind of rodents and creepy crawlies, or somebody goes into an attic, same thing. But every single time the rat, it's not like they kind of emerge from a hole or run out from like under a bed or something. It literally gets like thrown from off camera by somebody who's obviously the rat wrangler, who has then had to like throw it in, and then it lands in front of a woman who's then like, a rat! It's amazing. All three.
Oh my god, I genuinely did not notice that. I thought you were going to say the hand smushing. Which I think also appears in all three films.
Yes, it does.
Because there's very specific close-ups of a hand being smushed and kind of disintegrating into goo.
Yeah.
And these are quite cute words for essentially body gore.
Yeah, but they're good. Like the sort of end moments of the vampires throughout the trilogy are dramatic. Like there's a lot of almost to kind of like parody level, like you think they're dead and then they come back around just for some more kind of like, you know, in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, what, you know, the like iconic kind of like over-egged death scene, like it's a bit that. And yes, you're right, in all of them, when they then are gone, it's like this amazing, they obviously figured out the mechanism of how to do this effect, where they've got like, I don't know, like a rubber glove or whatever, and they've like filled it up with air, and then they just like slowly like suck out the air. So that is so good. It's so good. One thing I also really liked about the kind of the more gory side of things is, so obviously with stuff like Hammer, there's that really specific look to the blood, that very kind of red, like almost technicolor blood. Whereas I thought in these films, it was much more kind of realistic, and it didn't have that sort of that hyper realism and that sort of almost like campness to the gore. It was much more sort of it looked like these people were genuinely bleeding, and I was impressed.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, actually. It's like, yeah, with all the smushing, which might seem a little bit dated, the blood effects, like both there's a scene that I'd love for us to talk about in the third film, An Evil of Dracula, where there's quite a lot of splatter of blood. And throughout, both in Vampire Doll, where there's just like elements of blood kind of on a knife and on the vampire doll herself, and in Lake of Dracula as well, when they're bleeding and when they're being bitten, both the consistency and the coloring of the blood seem very grounded.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
there's I think there's that element of like eeriness. I mean, we know it's a film, okay, fine, that goes without saying, but there is, like you say, there's something that takes you out of some older effects heavy horror films, even if it's as simple as effect as blood. I mean, again, I know nothing about special effects, so I'm not diminishing the difficulty of producing like realistic looking blood, but like that Technicolor blood that you're talking about, like, it can take you out because they're like, oh, okay, the consistency is off. It's too Technicolor. And here there's that element of like when it's rolling down someone's chest or neck or hands, or even just kind of, caked on their mouth. It's a bit like, oh, that looks a little bit too real.
Agreed.
And because there's not that many effects anywhere else in the films, and they kind of feel so haunting. It kind of really worked. I think you're absolutely right. That's the element that really worked for me in terms of creepiness of the entire trilogy.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think grounded is a really good word for it, and it does sort of keep you in the moment of the horror of being attacked by a vampire.
There's something that we haven't talked about in Lake of Dracula, which I found quite interesting. I'd love to hear kind of what you thought about the way that vampires are explained as a genetic disease.
Yeah. Yes. It's almost like a sort of inherited thing. Is that right? Yeah, I thought it was good, actually. I kind of like that as an approach to the lore of vampire in this universe. And again, it seems to kind of root it in that more kind of folkloric side of things, this idea of them almost being known of, like it's not a kind of it's not an absolutely, like, there are points in the films when the men usually will be having a sort of slightly exposition heavy conversation about what's going on, but it's often quite matter of fact. Like, there's never too much sort of people being incredulous about vampires and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, like, there was this story of Dracula or there was a story of it's like it's a white man, isn't it, who kind of crashes off the coast and bites a local teenager, and they both then sort of come back to life, and then it does sort of come down the bloodline, as it were, and again, when that's being described and sort of explained, it's just like, oh yeah, cool. Like, yeah, that tracks.
Let's kind of move on to talking a little bit about Evil of Dracula, which that's a very telling laugh. This film. Go off, Becky, Dark. Go off.
I don't dislike it. I thought it was really fun. But, mate, like, of the three, this one it's fucked up. There's...
Where to begin?
Well, shall we begin at the fact that it's set at a school and there are a lot of older male teachers being very handsy with the young female pupils?
Oh, yeah. It's a very bizarre meld of the all girls boarding school subgenre of horror. Love. Very special place in my heart for it. And vampire films. And then sprinkled on top like some mid-70s, early 70s, like gender politics that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So, I mean, how to approach this?
There is one bit where the girls are playing tennis and the new teacher goes down to talk to them and they see one of the other teachers off in the distance and they're like, oh no, it's creepy Mr. Yoshi, and we don't like the way that he's looking at us all the time and like lurking around and just like won't stop looking at us. He's creepy. And then the new teacher says, well, you can't blame him. You're all very sexy. It's like,
yep.
So much to unpack there.
It's not gonna pass any, politically correct tests, is it?
It's not. And, I mean, there's also the possibility that by the end of the film, the teacher and one of the pupils are like 100% hooking up. But it was 1974 and, I've tried to not let that side of things diminish my enjoyment of the film, especially when there is such quality falling over throughout.
Rank your falling over moments, Becky.
Well, there are three key falling over moments, and when I say quality, I mean terrible falling over moments. Because obviously, because it's the 1970s and these are Dracula films, there's a lot of swooning and there's a lot of fainting and people being sort of knocked out and falling over. Now, I thought that Vampire Doll and Lake of Dracula both had pretty good falling over acting. It's a skill. I'm not saying that I could do it, but I can appreciate it in other people who are good at falling over on screen. Now, I don't know what happened in Evil of Dracula, but they'd obviously used their budget in the previous two films for the good falling over actors, because in this one, they will just like awkwardly sit down. It will be like, oh no, I've been hit on the head. Oh, I'll awkwardly sit down. Or, oh no, I'm overcome by the terror of my roommate vampire. I'll just like, I'm on the floor now. It's honestly, I'm falling. It was amazing. Yes, I wish the listeners could see your beautiful reenactment. That was perfect. They just kind of like. There's just a lot of sort of awkward sitting down when they're supposed... I don't know why this is what struck me. I love it so much with this film. Like, I just feel like so much of the kind of subtlety and, like sort of... This film, it doesn't have any subtlety. It's not very sort of misty and quiet. And it's like, oh, it's 1974 now. Cool. Right, well...
Boobs.
Let's have it. Yeah, boobs. Falling over and pervy teachers.
Yeah, and I have to admit, like the idea of pervy teachers is terrifying, especially at an all girls boarding school that may or may not have vampires involved. A pervy teacher who may or may not be a vampire is also quite a frightening proposition. So like I quite like the idea of it, but I don't know. Did you feel this way, or how did you experience it? Because I felt. It was quite, even though the previous film, Lake of Dracula, is quite exposition heavy, it felt quite thrilling. Like there was a mystery to unpack. Whereas I didn't feel that much of a connection to the mystery of Evil of Dracula.
I agree. I think I experienced it in a very similar way. I think with both of the previous ones, there really is that element of kind of detective work, and they're having to go around and talk to the local man who works at the garage, or they go to speak to the local doctor who did the autopsy on one of the dead women, or and there's this kind of piecing together of the sort of story of what's happening. Whereas with Evil of Dracula, I think you're right. There's much less kind of tension and mystery, and a lot more sort of like just badly choreographed fight scenes.
Yeah, I can't say I disagree, unfortunately. There is, however, a lot more, well, we have established a lot more boob, but also quite a bit more blood. Than any of the previous films. What did you make of like the horror elements of Evil of Dracula?
One of my favorite sequences of the whole of the three is somebody gets their face cut off and then like worn. I mean, as a huge Silence of the Lambs fan, this is the sort of thing that I like to see in my cinema, and I thought that was great. And at first, I was like, "What is happening here?" And then I realized what was happening, and I was like, "Hello."
When the person whose face gets taken off just gets like a close up of just a knife slicing into their chin, and then going like down the chin, like slicing a sourdough.
Exactly. And then like the actual kind of like fitting of the face onto the woman, like that was again like sort of uncanny, like this sort of jerky movements, and again that sort of dark hair sort of falling over it, which I think is probably like quite a sort of practical choice, because obviously that sort of hides some of the effects and stuff. I think it just worked really well, and I mean, I definitely appreciated the step up in the more kind of like physical horror of things. And I think you mentioned, or like you suggested earlier, about the bit where the girl is like literally like you got sort of a close up on her and she just keeps getting like sprayed with more blood. It's just like
yeah. And there's also a close up of this body, a naked woman's body, because 70s, and just a splatter of blood, kind of from the face slicing, the blood is splattering. I was like, oh, that's quite a bit. It's quite a bit of blood. I mean, it would be to expect it if someone's face is being cut off, but also kind of dramatic considering the bloodless approach to vampires in the previous two films, or except for choice scenes.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned it earlier, like the use of blood in the previous two is much more kind of like, somebody's been bitten and there is like a trickle, there's just like a trickle of blood kind of down their chest, or it's much more kind of sort of quick and then look away. Whereas with this, it really did feel like it was kind of lingering on those more kind of like blood-soaked moments. But because it being 74, obviously you've got to have lots of boobs and lots of nakedness, but there's this amazing framing that happens in that moment of the lady naked on the sort of slab, where in the foreground there's like a candlestick or something which just very conveniently covers her privates, and so you've got like legs. If you sort of look up from her feet, you get sort of feet, legs, candlestick, tummy, boobs, and then there's also something in the way of her face, so like you don't see the face cutting, you don't see her bush, but you kind of see everything else. It's amazing.
The Bloodthirsty Trilogy prioritizes breasts, and you know what? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
That's what they're going for.
And the other thing with, I think, the way that they've kind of, it's not gratuitous boob. Anna, because what we find out in this one is that they're all being bitten on the boob. So you never just see boob for the sake of boob. You're always seeing boob, but also with the kind of plot-based bite mark.
You're saying it's plot-based boob?
Plot-based boob.
The hashtag will start trending immediately. Plot-based boob. That's a narrative device that every screenwriter should have up their sleeve, right? If there's ever a monster or a vampire, like, forget about next. Bite him on the boob.
Yeah. Make it plot-based.
Yeah, and then you can justify a close-up of a woman's nipple. Completely out of context with blood running down the breast.
Was it John Carpenter or Wes Craven who said something about... he'd have blood in his films and he'd have nudity in his films, but never the twain shall meet. That is not a consideration for this. It's like, no, we're having boobs and bloods and everything else just all on screen at once, but no bush.
You dip one in the other. Well, if they got to make a fourth film, maybe we would have gotten some bush, but
the bush.
It's not the 80s yet.
For the reboot.
Well, I'm interested in what you mentioned at the beginning of our chat. There's something really interesting that you mentioned about the kind of the hair horror of it, but also about that you see the seeds of the explosion of J horror in the 90s. And I was wondering kind of what are those seeds that you see that kind of you then see decades afterwards in J horror films?
I mean, there are moments in these films that I feel could almost have been lifted from, Ringu or The Grudge. Those are the two that I'm most familiar with. Battle Royale as well. Like, there's that moment when they kind of flash back to. It's a very sort of brief but iconic moment from the film. They flash back to one of the winners of the previous games, and she has just sort of been brought back to the city, the real world. And she's holding the doll in her lap, and her face is like splattered with blood, and she's just got that very uncanny smile on her face. And I feel like there's almost a J horror smile, that sort of sinister knowing. It's like the smile is all in the mouth and not at all in the eyes, and there's definitely moments in these, especially in Vampire Doll has got the most creepy smiling, and moments like in Lake of Dracula with the girl sat at the piano, you just see her back, and the very, she's wearing a pale dress, very long black hair, and she sort of turns very, very slowly, and then all of a sudden you get sort of a very sort of intense close-up of her face. There's a lot of intense eye work. Like, I just feel like all of this is something that, is used really effectively in this trilogy, but kind of like imagery wise could almost be, plucked from any of those sort of big 90s, 2000s boom of the J horrors.
Before we start wrapping up, you mentioned that you can see kind of threats between all three of the films, and like I mentioned before, these films are not really connected to each other narratively. You can watch them in whatever order you want. We watch them chronologically, but you can kind of dip in and out into any one of these films. But what threads in between them do you see that kind of run through all three of the films, either visually or thematically, or in terms of how vampires are presented? Kind of what do you see that they have in common?
So I think visually, the houses and the buildings are very, very similar in all of them. They are, as I sort of said earlier, quite sort of Western Gothic in their style, considering, these are very obviously Japanese films. But there is that that influence of, you know, Hammer and Western Gothic kind of running throughout. So the houses are big and hulking and looming. There are sort of staircases, sweeping staircases and sort of mezzanines that vampires can sort of lurk at the top of and look down at you. There is this idea of kind of nature running through them, whether that be the sort of lakeside or the woods, this kind of idea of folklore and sort of local legend is really grounded in, that I really liked. There's an idea of sort of like dreams and sort of repressed memories and things running through these films as well. Things being dreamt that the characters couldn't possibly know, and so they assume it's a dream, but then they realize actually it's a memory from when they were a child, or it's like some kind of hypnosis or something like that. And I found that really interesting, that kind of more sort of psychological side of like vampire films, the sorts of, you know, dreams and sleepwalking and all of that, which I find, you know, really atmospheric. And like loads of big hair and mustard and brown and mini skirts, you know, because it's the 70s.
Hey, I love a mustard miniskirt.
Oh,
mustard anything.
Oh, there's a lot of, obviously, because it's the 70s, and obviously because these are vampire films, it gives a lot of opportunity for roll neck jumpers, because if you're not being bitten on the boob, you're being bitten on the neck, and so you need something to cover that. And you know, the fashions are just like in the second one, like I could write an entire essay on the like nylon nightwear from these films. There's one bit where a woman has been, she's been hospitalized and she sort of comes to, like there's a lot of like falling over banisters and balconies in these films. And in Lake of Dracula, a woman comes to in hospital, runs around in an incredible like sheer baby blue sort of baby doll dress, and then falls over a banister to her death. Like, you know, I mean, these are the sort of stylistic flourishes, Anna, that you just don't get in any other decade. And that's why I think that, you know, the 70s and vampire films just really like, they really complement each other, you know?
Also, Dracula, just like I want to say he's wearing, is it a white or a black turtleneck?
White turtleneck under a black suit. So at times he does look a little bit too like priest-like. But yeah, I mean, like just very suave, incredible kind of sort of like almost like a Paul Weller-esque haircut. You know, sort of just all like pushed very forward onto his face. But there's Dracula. I have to reiterate, he doesn't have enough swagger, and I didn't find him alluring in these films. I wanted a bit more. Like he's just a bit sort of grunty, you know.
Like you said, he's not Frank Langella.
Well, I mean, what are you gonna do?
Well, quite. Becky, conscious of your time, I just wanted to ask you a final question, and it's, you know, we've skirted around spoilers and plot details in order to encourage people to maybe give these films a chance. And would you recommend contemporary horror fans or vampire film fans to seek these films out?
Yeah, definitely. I think if you are I think if you are a fan of like 70s horror, of 70s vampires, of Japanese cinema, Japanese horror, if you're a fan of Hammer and you want to see something that's kind of contemporary from another part of the world. And also, like, they're super short. They're all, like, I think the longest one is 88 minutes. So they're all sub 90 minutes. This week, like, for 3 days in a row, I just chucked one on after work. Like, they're just so perfect, really easy to watch. They look amazing. They're a lot of fun. And, when they are at their best, they're like really kind of atmospheric and stylish. And there were a couple of moments that, like, with that sort of that uncanny side of the kind of the Japanese horror aesthetic, like I found it pretty creepy. So yeah, I mean, like, big yes from me.
Amazing. Becky, as always, thank you so much for your time and for your insight and for the hair puns. And where can people find more of your work online?
Oh, well, thank you for having me, as always, Anna. I mean, just what a joy. And thank you for introducing me to these films. Like, I'll definitely be delving into that DVD box set again before too long, because I genuinely loved them. So where can you find me? I've actually just started a Patreon. So that is somewhere that people can support my podcasting and my writing work if they would like to. Obviously, I know that with the shit show that is the world at the moment, money isn't kind of an appropriate way for everybody to be supportive of content. But if you do have any spare pennies that you want to throw my way, that would be amazing. And I'm kind of, there's a few different tiers, as there always are, and I'm sort of doing little roundups of my work and some kind of early access stuff and some exclusive material and stuff. So you can find me at patreon.com/bunnydark. And I'm also Bunny Dark on Twitter and Instagram.
Beautiful. And that's it for this episode of the Final Girls podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you can, do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Takes 30 seconds, really helps a lot. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalgirls.co.uk. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Girls UK. If you can, do head over to our Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls, where we will be posting bonus episodes and more goodies. You can also follow Becky on Twitter at BunnyDark, and I am at Anna B. Demented. Thank you for listening, and next week, we're going to finish off the 90s decade proper with Dusk Till Dawn, and we'll be entering the noughties with 30 Days of Night.